During one of the scariest battles in human history, there is a detail that sounds almost absurd. Some German tank units were recorded as having casualty rates of more than 100%. That number was not a typo. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what that means and why it happened through the turbulent but rarely told story of the Panzer IV, the tank that has all but faded from public memory today. To understand how things could spiral that far, we have to go back to the very beginning. The Panzer IV was one of the key tanks of the Second World War, yet it is often relegated to a secondary role in popular imagination. You will rarely see it take the spotlight next to headline-grabbing names like the Tiger or the Panther, even though it was the Panzer IV that carried German units from the opening shots in Poland all the way to the ruins of Berlin, and through almost every stage in between. Ironically, it wasn't even created to be a star on the battlefield. Yet in the end, it became the backbone of Germany's armored forces. And to understand how a machine like that could be at the center of casualty figures exceeding 100%, we need to start from its earliest days. In the early 1930s, while most of Europe believed the Treaty of Versailles had bound Germany's hands, Berlin quietly began rebuilding its military apparatus. In that context, the tank that would later be known as the Panzer IV was categorized as a support vehicle. And we need to remember that at this time, the very concept of the tank was still being invented. Nobody was thinking yet in terms of a single all-purpose design like the Soviet T-34 or the American Sherman. Names that would later pave the way for the main battle tank idea every military student knows today. Instead, the German High Command pictured their armored forces as two distinct branches, one dedicated to hunting enemy tanks, the other designed to fight alongside infantry. The Panzer III was intended as the tank hunter armed with a 37 Fanchide a 90mm gun, the same caliber as the standard German infantry anti-tank gun of the time. In the early years, that was enough. The Germans even gave it a somewhat modest nickname, the door knocker, because it often had to fire multiple times before finally bringing down a target. But as the armor on foreign tanks thickened rapidly, the 37 mm gun had to give way to a more powerful 50 mm weapon, and the limits of how far the Panzer III could be upgraded became increasingly obvious. That breakthrough came 4 years later with the arrival of the MG-34, the first true general-purpose machine gun in the world. Its early variants from A to F1 all mounted the short-barreled 75mm KWK-37, a low-velocity gun, well-suited to firing high-explosive shells at infantry positions, machine gun nests, and light field fortifications. In short, against soft targets, the Panzer IV was a formidable tool. Its weakness appeared when it faced armored opponents that gun was almost incapable of penetrating medium-thickness armor. However, in 1939-1940, that was not the main concern. Enemy tanks were still relatively rare, and the job of killing them had been assigned to the Panzer III. So when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the limited number of Panzer IVs did exactly what they had been designed to do: advance behind the leading formations, provide fire support, and rarely worry about trading shots with enemy armor. It was a seemingly modest starting point, but one that would lay the foundation for a very different story later on. In the French campaign, the overall picture on the battlefield remained much the same. Most Allied tanks were outdated or scattered and used piecemeal, so they never managed to deliver their full potential. A few models like the French Char B1 or the S-35 with their thick armor did make German crews freeze for a moment, but the decisive factors in the end were the tempo organization and command structure of the panzer divisions. It wasn't the biggest gun that won, it was the formation that could coordinate best. At this point, radio communication became an invisible but extremely powerful weapon. Nearly every German tank had a radio, whereas on the French and British side, radios were usually reserved for command vehicles. That one small difference created a huge gap in flexibility. German formations could change direction, concentrate firepower, and shift their axis of attack in a matter of minutes. This is what turned blitzkrieg thrusts into blows so fast that the enemy often didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Within that picture, the Panzer IV kept doing its assigned job. It remained the armored artillery, but the main complaint from its crews persisted. The armor was too thin. With only 15-25mm of armor on the early models, it was barely adequate against heavy machine gun fire and woefully vulnerable to anti-tank guns. And soon the first real cracks in German armored superiority would begin to show. The illusion of overwhelming German tank dominance would be tested to the limit once they turned east, where very different armored beasts were waiting. Here we first have to talk about the KV-1. This was a true heavy steel behemoth weighing around 47 tons and armed with a 76mm gun that was considered very powerful at the time. Its frontal armor was so thick that at many ranges, the KV-1 was nearly immune to both the 37 mm and even the 50-meter guns mounted on the Panzer III. For German crews, it wasn't just a target anymore. It was a wall. To bring one down, they had to drag 88mm anti-aircraft guns up to the front line, or gather multiple tanks and concentrate their fire on a single KV-1 to have any hope of destroying it. One tank, but it took an entire system to deal with it. Yet even that wasn't the worst part. The real shock came from the T-34, a tank that until then the Germans hadn't even known was being produced. The T-34 combined sloped armor, a high-velocity 76mm gun-wide tracks that allowed it to move well through mud and snow, and a diesel engine that proved more reliable in harsh conditions. In terms of overall design, the T-34 looked like a leap into a new generation, outperforming German tanks in most of the key categories that mattered. German crews were stunned. And the more worrying issue was this: the Panzer III had reached the end of its evolution. Its turret ring was too small to accept a much larger gun. The upgraded 50mm L60 gun, though longer and more powerful, still failed to keep pace with the reality of the battlefield. The tank that had once been expected to be the backbone of German armor had clearly reached the end of its useful life in that role. Because of this, the Germans were forced to turn to the Panzer IV. Ironically, the vehicle that had been designed purely as an infantry support tank now became their best remaining option, at least to buy more time. Its larger turret ring and more flexible design allowed for the installation of a long-barreled, high-velocity gun. And once that shift was made, the fate of the Panzer IV changed completely. It was no longer a supporting character. T was stepping onto center stage. In early 1942, a quiet but decisive turning point arrived. The Panzer IV F2 variant was introduced armed with the 7.5 cm KWK-40 L43. From being an armored artillery piece aimed mainly at soft targets, it now had the ability to punch through the T-34's sloped armor at ranges beyond 1,000 meters. Just a year later, the G variant followed with improved armor and the even longer L48 gun, offering higher muzzle velocity and better penetration still. In other words, from this point on, the Panzer IV no longer trailed behind, it moved to the very front. The tank that had not been born to fight other tanks suddenly became the primary spearhead. Crews who once were thought of as artillerymen riding on tracks now formed the core of Germany's armored fist. The Panzer IV appeared on every front, given the task of facing enemy tanks head-on, holding defensive lines and leading armored thrusts. Meanwhile, the Panzer III quietly withdrew from its frontline role, its chassis reused to build assault guns and self-propelled guns. Heavy tanks like the Tiger and the Panther looked formidable on paper, but they were few in number, complex, prone to breakdown, and ultimately could not replace the Panzer IV in the day-to-day reality of the battlefield. Put simply, when commanders needed a tank, they could count on to actually be there. They called for the Panzer IV, but the battlefield never stands still. Soviet tank factories ramped up to maximum output, preparing to unleash new waves of armor that would make earlier challenges look like mere warm-up rounds. By early 1943, the Panzer IV had become the most common and most important tank in the German army. The H variant appeared with extra bolted-on armor on the front, adding around 18 millimeters of thickness, along with shirts and side skirts, mounted along the hull and turret. These plates were designed to disrupt projectiles from anti-tank rifles like the PTR-D41, which were widespread on the Eastern Front, by deflecting or detonating them before they could reach the main armor. However, these additions in armor and the heavier gun came with an unavoidable cost. A chassis that had not been designed for that much weight was being pushed to its limits. Gearboxes failed, tracks broke, and mechanical issues multiplied, especially in mud and freezing conditions. This was the tool that lifted the entire system to another level, turning the MG from a light weapon into a true heavy fire platform. In 1943, if you just looked at the catalog of available weapons, the Panzer IV didn't appear to be the star. the Tiger could destroy Allied tanks at ranges from which they had little hope of firing back, but it was a luxury item, rare, steel-hungry, time-consuming, to build and demanding in terms of maintenance and skilled crews. Its limited numbers meant it could never be everywhere. The Panther was designed as the new medium tank with sloped armor and a long 75mm gun, offering powerful penetration, a promising answer to the T-34 on paper. But the Panther was rushed into service. Early batches were plagued with mechanical failures. At Kursk, many broke down after only a few dozen kilometers, forcing units to divert resources for recovery operations, while the Panzer IV still had to carry the brunt of the fighting. At the same time, self-propelled tank destroyers like the Stu-G3 were evolving. Originally built for infantry support, it slowly became one of the most effective tank killers in the German arsenal. A low silhouette that was hard to spot, good firepower, relatively cheap to produce. And armed with the same gun as the Panzer IV, making it especially lethal in ambush. The downside was its lack of a turret, which made reacting to rapidly changing situations more difficult. Meanwhile, the Red Army was moving in a different direction. The T-34 was upgraded and produced in staggering numbers, at times more than 1,000 units per month. It still had many flaws, from the two-man turret to cramped internals and rushed crew training, but sheer numbers compensated for them. The Soviet command could afford to lose more tanks per German tank destroyed and still keep the offensive momentum, while more and more self-propelled guns with heavy artillery pieces on tank chassis appeared capable of threatening even Germany's heaviest tanks. If you were a German tank commander in mid-1943, you understood very clearly that you were fighting a war of attrition. Your opponent had more tanks, more factories, and more fresh troops to feed into the line. Every tactical victory increasingly felt like buying time, not changing the ultimate outcome. And above it all, you could sense that a massive showdown was gathering ahead. Both sides knew that sooner or later there would be a decisive confrontation. The German High Command planned Operation Citadel, a large-scale attack against the Kursk salient held by the Red Army, intended to encircle and annihilate Soviet forces there. But the Soviets were not caught off guard. They prepared layered defenses, minefields, dense belts of anti-tank guns, and a sprawling system of trenches and fortifications. Hitler still believed it was a gamble worth taking, convinced that with the new tanks, Germany could smash through the Soviet lines. The result was one of the largest and fiercest armored clashes in history. More than 6,000 tanks, 2 million soldiers, and thousands of aircraft committed. And at the very center of that steel storm, the Panzer IV and its crews were about to face the hardest trial of their entire war, Kursk. At dawn on July 5, 1943, the Germans launched their last great offensive on the Eastern Front. This was an all-in gamble. If it succeeded, they might regain the initiative. If it failed, the window of opportunity would close for good. The attack came from two directions, and in the south, the very tip of the armored spear. The Panzer IVs were ordered to lead. What lay ahead of them was not just a defensive line, but a labyrinth of fire, one of the most heavily fortified zones in the history of warfare. The Soviets had known about the operation for months. Through partisan networks and code breaking, they had a very good idea of German intentions. Layers of defenses were built, more than 1 million mines, thousands of anti-tank guns, countless strong points and bunkers stretching for tens of kilometers, all designed to grind down every German tank company that tried to push through. The Panzer IVs rolled forward with Tigers and Panthers in support. But many of the new Panthers broke down on the way to the battlefield. Rushed production had turned them from wonder weapons into burdens. And in a now familiar pattern, the real burden of the breakthrough fell once again on the Panzer IV. These armored workhorses had to cross exposed minefields under pre-sighted artillery and carefully hidden anti-tank guns. German tanks were knocked out and left scattered across both flanks of the battlefield. Those that were not completely burned out were towed back by recovery vehicles at night, patched up just enough, and sent forward again the next morning, often with entirely new crews because the original men were either dead or in field hospitals. It was here that the number in our title takes on its full chilling meaning. German records from Kursk show that in some tank units, the number of crewmen killed and wounded actually exceeded the total original strength of those units' crews. In plain terms, casualties above 100%. The same hull went into battle again and again with Crew A, then Crew B, then Crew C, until there was nobody left to put inside. One chassis, several souls. The men sent to fill the gaps were often teenagers, barely out of training school, pushed into patched-up vehicles, hardly familiar with their weapons, and ordered to replace veterans who had fallen only hours earlier. A tanker from the 11th Panzer Division wrote, "We didn't even have time to learn each other's names. We just climbed in, started the engine, and drove off waiting for our turn." Their turn, meaning the moment when their tank was hit. On the other side, Soviet tank units were also sometimes wiped out in a single day. The difference was that they had enough men and enough tanks to absorb those numbers and still keep attacking. Waves of T-34s came on one after another as if they would never run out.